Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Well, do you think we ought to fix our democracy? Something broken about democracy? I've been lying awake at night worrying about democracy. And I suppose it varies according to what country you're in. And some of you viewers will be watching from another country where this may not be on your mind. But we here in Canada have a lot of things that we've been thinking about, including whether or not to change our electoral system. We have a system, of course, called fair first past the post, which is I don't know where that came from, but it's somebody will explain that to me. Question is, do we have any improvements that should be made to democracy, and do we need any? Well, I have here three people who spend a lot more time worrying about that issue than I do. And in no particular order, Anthony Hodgson is president of Fair Vote BC, because in British Columbia, there have been numerous efforts to change the voting system to proportional representation. And in Ottawa, Réal Laverne is a researcher, an academic, and civil servant who has a PhD in political economy, and he's now the president of Fair Vote Canada, and has been since 2016. And I think in BC, Gisela Ruckert is a leader of the pro-proportional representation movement during the referendum in 2018 that took place on electoral reform in British Columbia. And she's very much an advocate for more resilient local communities. Hello, my friends. Welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Happy to be here.
All right. Now, let's get right down to it. I want to ask you folks, do we have a real need for changing our electoral system, or is there even something bigger that's wrong with democracy these days? Who wants to tackle that first?
Well, why don't I start with a couple of thoughts about the current state of our democracy and what we're actually looking for in a democratic system. I think if we think about our fundamental democratic values, that always gets us off on a good footing. The first thing I like to say is that we have a pretty good democracy in Canada. According to the Economist Index of Democracies, we place something like position 6th in the world, second after Denmark, depending on the year. And there's a lot of good things about a democracy. When we compare with what's going on south of the border here, we feel like we're living in a democratic paradise. But one of the things that the Economist Index doesn't take into account is the way we actually elect our representatives. And that's really fundamental. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how to fix something which is a fundamental flaw in our current electoral system. And in order to appreciate some of the arguments behind that, I think it's useful to look back a little bit and ask ourselves what it is that we actually are looking for in a democracy. We have an idea that democracy is about majority rule. And in fact, when we think about it, when we make decisions in a democratic way in our family, with friends, at work, we don't actually use majority rule that much. What we're really trying to do is establish a consensus in order to solve a problem that we share collectively. It may be, what movie would we like to watch? What would we like to order for dinner? These kinds of questions. Consensus is actually the most important thing, and it's about solving collective problems. So that's the main thing, that it's about consensus, it's about inclusion, dialogue to decide on issues of shared interest, collaboration. Those are the kind of values that most people put front and center when they're thinking about democracy. And as soon as they start doing that, they start realizing, if they think about our current electoral system, that it is, in fact, fundamentally flawed.
In my day job, I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at UBC. And so I develop technologies for use in surgery. And the process that we use is the engineering design process. And just in complete accord with what Réal was saying, there's no way that you can get a good design result if you systematically ignore the views of certain people who are involved in the process. If I try to design a device for use in surgery and I just go in and tell the doctor what I think needs to happen, and I produce some technology that works in the lab, but has completely failed to take account of what their surgical priorities are. Or if I collaborate with the surgeon and come up with a device and put it into the OR, and we're very happy with it, but it can't be sterilized, and so the equipment processing people don't know what to do with it and can't actually deliver it into the OR. It's just disaster. The technology doesn't go anywhere. So I'm really used to this idea of starting out from a process of dialogue, from identifying all the people who would be affected by, in this case, we're talking about public policy, and trying to understand at a deep level how the issue affects them, what their concerns are. And really, I think we would all agree that the optimal public policy would be one that, to the greatest extent possible, addresses the needs and concerns of everybody. And our current political system does not deliver this. It really creates a very antagonistic, adversarial process. Mm-hmm. I think of majority rule as kind of the fallback if we can't achieve consensus. It's a way to at least try to move forward in the absence of any agreement. But I think that it's really important to highlight the idea that what we should be striving for are optimal public policies that include as many people as possible.
Right. And if I could just take off from where you're leaving off there, Tony, I think that we all agree that the system should be an accurate reflection of what people voted for. And that's where our system fundamentally fails. We have a system that doesn't accurately reflect what voters intended when they cast their ballots. So, for example, we most frequently in our governments have a situation where we have a majority government, and that means one party holds the majority of seats, which gives them the power to do pretty much what they would like. They can pass the legislation without support from other parties. What most people don't realize when they hear the term majority government is that it's not usually a majority of voters who supported that party to get that number of seats. It's quite frequent for us to have a number somewhere in the 30s. So for both the Harper majority and the first Trudeau majority, it was 39% of the public who voted for those respective parties and gave them about 54% of the seats in the House, which gave them total control of the legislative process in Parliament. So the system doesn't reflect what a majority of voters actually wanted, which leads to the second big problem with our current governance system, in that it's very easy for parties to be you probably heard the term kick the bums out. That seems to be our remedy for unrepresentative government. We decide, oh, well, they're not doing what we asked for, so we'll vote in the next party with, again, 39% of the vote or so. And the policies of the previous government are reversed. So this is a phenomenon that's called policy lurch, and it's a pendulum swinging back and forth, too far one way, then too far the other way. And what we would ideally like is where those parties have to agree in advance to something that they can both live with, which would represent what the majority of voters wanted. And that more cooperative, consensual style is what is used in most of the democratic world at this point, and that's proportional representation.
Could I ask whether or not that would take care of another issue that comes about, which I think is that politicians have a very limited horizon in time, that at least the ones I know can't make plans for 30, 40 years in advance. They can only see as far as the next election. And I have never thought about this, whether or not having a PR system would have any bearing on that. Would it? And if so, tell me why. I really don't know the answer.
It does, and the reason is that under a proportional representation system, the vote share of a party is typically relatively stable and depends on creating a long-term affiliation with that party based on party values and that kind of long-term vision that you're talking about. And one of the interesting things that, I mean, it's kind of hard to understand how it actually works, but empirically, this is the interesting part, is in actual fact, countries that have proportional representation pay more attention to long-term issues than countries that have first past the post. And
Well,
this
and this
means
is
environmental.
really established. It's not.
It's really established and firmly established. Environmental issues, even economic issues, issues of economic stability, running deficits. They run smaller deficits. They have better growth policies across the board. Social inequality is less. This is really quite interesting, and you really hit on there one of the major differences between proportional representation and first past the post countries.
Well, you know what a PR system is. It's not obvious to everybody. So I think maybe somebody will do us a favor by sort of explaining what PR is and how it differs from first past the post. And in fact, of course, there are many different forms of both. So what do we need to be looking for in terms of the options that are really available for us?
If you'd like, I've got a short slideshow that we used way back when in I think it was the 2009 referendum in BC about this raises some issues that I think we're going to talk about a little later. But BC had what's called a citizens' assembly. And that we can go into that in more detail in a few minutes, but they made a recommendation for a change to a different kind of voting system. And so we had a presentation that we gave, and I'd be happy to just share that if you would like. So we use Smarties for this, so called it a smartier way to vote. So this sort of explains how a little bit about how our current system works and then what the proposal was. So, as this says, some of our neighbors share our political views and others don't. So that makes life interesting. And, you might be sitting beside somebody who disagrees with you politically. But when it comes time to vote, what we end up doing is dividing ourselves up into ridings. So geographically proximate areas, and each one of those ridings has voters of different political views in it. So we're not homogeneous. I don't live in an area that's all liberal supporters or all conservative supporters or whatever. We have neighbors with different views. In our current voting system, each party puts up a candidate to represent their perspective, and one candidate is elected per riding based on whichever party gets the most votes in the riding. So you line it all up, and in this particular case, you can see that even though there are a fair number of blue voters, the yellow voters win actually all 3 seats. So that's one of the things that happens with our current voting system. And so in our legislative assembly, there would be no blue representatives, no representatives from the blue party here.
Mm-hmm.
So the yellow party supporters are probably pretty happy, but the blue party supporters are not.
Mm-hmm.
So the BCSTV approach takes a much more inclusive approach. The idea is to make sure that almost everybody gets an MLA that they want to see elected. And in this particular system, what happens is that parties will put up lists of candidates. They'll put up more than one candidate and will elect representatives over a bigger region. So here we're still electing 3 representatives from what used to be 3 single member ridings. And so any voter can vote for any of the candidates that's put up there. That gave the voters more choice. Naturally, what happens is that the yellow party supporting voters tend to vote primarily for the yellow party candidates and vice versa for the blue. And in the end, what happens is the voters sort of coalesce behind particular candidates. And so you see that there was an absolute majority of yellow party supporters in this example. So they end up with 2 of the 3 representatives, but the blue party supporting voters do actually get to elect a blue candidate. Mm-hmm. So that's basically how it works. That's what proportional voting is, and that's how STV in particular works.
Right now, I think, for example, Israel is almost paralyzed because they keep having elections and elections, and they can't seem to get a combination of people together to form a government. And they keep redoing their elections, and so far, nobody's been able to put together the right package. Is that an inherent failing of a PR system? Or is there any solution?
Italy and Israel, you haven't mentioned Italy yet, but that's often the next one that PR opponents bring up, are examples of countries that have political systems, electoral systems that have never been recommended for Canada. Specifically, they have a very low threshold. All of the systems that have been recommended for Canada would be more similar to the ones in the countries that we generally think about as models for proportional representation. So countries like Scotland, Germany, New Zealand, most of the world using the proportional systems doesn't have those problems. And certainly the argument can be made that Israel's problems go far deeper than an electoral system. It's a very polarized society, very divided along ethnic and religious lines. And any system would have a hard time keeping that population unified under a single government. But I think the main response there is that is an example of a system which is proportional, but it's not one of the ones that we would be using here in Canada. All of the systems that have been recommended for Canada would maintain the local representation on a local level, as well as ensuring that all voices are heard. So not an across-the-board numerical formula for creating many, many different parties. In fact, when New Zealand transitioned to proportional representation from our system in the 1990s, they used to have exactly the same outcomes that we have, where they would flip largely between two major parties. And they had a few other parties that were active but were unsuccessful in forming government in much the same way that we have in Canada. But now they average between, I think it's about 6 parties that are currently holding seats. I think it's between 5 and 8. So we would probably see an increase in the number of parties in our government, but it would not result in the lack of stability that we see in countries with no thresholds or very low thresholds.
Well, when you say very low thresholds, what do you mean by that? You mean that to get a seat at all, you'd have to have a high percentage, a certain percentage, like 10% or 5% of the votes, and the smaller parties would not be represented.
But we have a choice here of either concentrating power or messy. And so the choice is it better to maybe be paralyzed in some cases than to concentrate all of the power on one side arbitrarily, which is what the alternative would be under first past the post. But the whole point of first past the post is to concentrate power. And yes, that makes certain things easier, but it makes also for poorer policy. And I would argue that even in the case of Israel, however messy it looks, that's the preferable option. And that's why that country has stuck with that option rather than first past the post.
In terms of your question regarding thresholds, Metta, most proportional representation systems have a threshold that says a party needs to win a certain percentage of the vote, as you said, in order to win a seat. In many places, that's about 5%. And that's, as far as the models for Canada have been defined, we're in that range as well.
Is that the problem largely in Israel, that they have a lot of parties that get like 2% or something? Is that?
Yeah.
They have a lot of parties, but other countries can have a lot of parties and work perfectly well. Mm-hmm. Netherlands, for example.
Really?
But the more parties you have, it's kind of messier, right. I guess.
Well, now, somebody was trying to explain to me what Germany's system is, and I never understood it. Sounds like they vote for 2 different types of deputies or so. Do we need to know about that? And is that an option we should think about?
I'll just quickly say that all of the systems are a little bit different, but they share some common values. And in contrast to first past the post, where we elect only 1 representative per riding, the proportional systems all ensure that each geographic area has more than one representative. Because it's, as the Smarties example that Tony gave us showed, it's impossible for one representative to represent the diversity of voices and values in that riding. And currently we have ridings where 70% of the voters elected no one. That's how fractured the vote is. So in contrast, any PR voting system elects several representatives at once for a given geographic region, so that most voters in that region have a voice in Parliament. And that leads to far fewer wasted votes. So with respect to the German model, Tony explained STV in a very basic way, but the German model is mixed member proportional, which is often called MMP for short. And basically what they do is they elect one person locally and several people regionally. So they would have local small ridings and overlaying that a layer of larger regional ridings, so that everyone, even if they don't feel particularly represented by the person who is their local representative, can go to the regional one whose job it also is to support them. So that provides the variety of representation from different parts of the political spectrum that more accurately reflect voters' values.
Is there higher voter turnout in countries with PR? Do people feel more inclined to go vote rather than just hope for the best?
Yeah, normally in PR countries, we're looking at 5 to 7 percentage points higher in terms of turnout.
Mm-hmm. That's typical.
That's the, if you do statistical analysis, because it goes up and down from country to country, that's kind of like when you do your regression at your statistical analysis, it shows 7 percentage points more by virtue of being a proportional country. Okay,
now satisfaction by of voters with government in general and politicians. I've seen polls where people ask, do you trust journalists? Do you trust scientists? Do you trust politicians, etc.? Politicians, at least in North America, and I think Canada as well as the US, so maybe we're a little better, people tend not to think politicians are very good people. Is there any difference when you ask people's satisfaction with politicians in PR systems or not?
It's the same kind of thing. You're going to get in proportional countries more satisfaction, but it's hard to say, because what happens is as you change to another system, your expectations go up as well. So people could still be dissatisfied, but that doesn't mean they're not, in a sense, more satisfied. I think the test is whether people who already have a country with proportional representation ever want to go back to first past the post. And, if you ask somebody from the Netherlands or Germany about first past the post, they'll just scoff at you and laugh. Of course, they wouldn't consider going back to first past the post.
Well, when were they?
That's the real test.
When did they switch? Were they originally, and how long ago were they first past the post?
Most countries using proportional representation switched about 100 years ago, which happens to be the first time that a Canadian government was elected on a promise to reform our own electoral system. So countries like Germany and most of the European contingent using proportional representation were part of a wave of democratic renewal about 100 years ago. And the countries that didn't get on that wave, including the only 3 major Western democracies still using first past the post, are Canada, the UK, and the United States, pardon me. So those 3 countries inherited the Westminster system, and it's been very difficult for us to trade up from that system since we missed that initial sort of wave of momentum.
I see. Why? I mean, have people? I expect you've really done Monday morning quarterbacking about why things have not usually worked out the way you wanted.
I mean, I think in the end, any proposed change involves a change in the circumstances of the people who are currently in power. And so there is a self-interest issue in changing our voting system, in much the same way that I think we've all seen examples at the city council level or the provincial legislature level or the parliamentary level, when there are discussions about what the pay of MPs or MLAs or councillors should be. And there's a real sense that the representatives are conflicted in this case. That they shouldn't have absolute freedom to set their own pay or set their own working conditions or set the terms under which they get their job. But the way our Constitution works, it actually invests that power, the power to determine the process of selection, in the very people who hold it. And so I think that largely explains the reluctance to change. And so, just to be very concrete about it, in the Canadian voting system at the federal level, I think one of the things we didn't really talk about before was the fact that the way our voting system works, it creates heavy regional concentrations of MPs from particular parties. And so we see that, the sweep of Atlantic Canada by Liberal MPs, or, I remember at least one election where the Liberals took every single seat in Ontario. And we have examples in recent electoral history of Conservative Party MPs taking every single seat in Western provinces. And so this kind of thing happens. So if you imagine, and we have this situation right now, that there's overrepresentation of Conservatives in the West, there's overrepresentation of Liberals in the East. And if you imagine going to a system where at a regional level, there's greater overall balance, it means that some Liberal MPs in the East are not going to have a job next time. And some Conservative MPs in the West are not going to have a job next time. And some, NDP representatives in certain parts of BC are not going to have a job next time if we make a change. And so when individual MPs start thinking about whether they should vote for this change, at the very least, in the back of their own minds, and whether they say it out loud or not, they're going to be doing these calculations. So I think that's a very important dynamic.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, though, whether it's caused by the failure of PR to make it over the line of success, whether it's caused by the reluctance of the politicians or that the voters themselves can't be persuaded of it. I just wonder. Yeah.
I think your question is a very good one, because I think when we have referendums, we see, well, the people just didn't support it, so the people don't want it. But when we look more closely at the referendum results, we realize that most people voted on the basis of messaging coming from the no side, most people who voted no. Some of which, actually, in the case of the BC referendum, most of which was demonstrably false if you look at them on an objective basis. So we have to look at the reasons. First of all, why does it go to a referendum? There's no need for a referendum. Very few countries have adopted proportional representation via a referendum process. Really? There's no requirement for it. And yet,
you mean,
we in Canada
constitutionally, there's no requirement for it. We could
not at all.
How could it happen then?
In fact, the most common method for changes in our Canadian electoral system has been simple legislation implemented by either the province or the national government. That's a perfectly legitimate way of changing our electoral system. And even if a referendum were to succeed, it would still take the government to implement legislation. That is the deciding body. So that raises the question of, why do we have referendums? And I think this is exactly where Tony's point about political self-interest steps in. The research on referendums shows that it is often, the referendum tool is often used as a screen by politicians to be seen to be taking action on something which they're actually quite lukewarm about, even though they may be superficially expressing support. And we've seen this movie over and over. We've seen political parties espousing the benefits of reform until they get into a position to implement it, at which point they get cold feet because, as Tony pointed out, they're realizing, not all of our team is going to be on these benches next time. If this goes through, we'll have a more representative sample, which would include more members from other parties. So maybe we shouldn't rush into this, which was the sentiment in 1921, Mackenzie King. Let's not be hasty. So I guess the question is, when is it time? It's never a good time, according to the government in power. And that's why they use a referendum. And I can go into far too much detail on the research on referendums, which shows a significant advantage to the no side in any referendum campaign. California has a very strong referendum industry. They use referendums on a lot of their proposed legislative changes. And the research from the California referendums is very clear, which is why polling companies, why companies working to push one side or another on a referendum issue won't touch it unless the issue is polling at least 70% 1 year in advance of the referendum, because invariably the support for the yes side drops during the referendum due to the negative messaging from the no side. And it's considered unwinnable if it's not leading by that much of by that degree 1 year prior to the referendum.
I could just add that there have been at least 4 referenda that I can think of in Canada's history that have delivered solid majorities in favor of change. So 2 of those, one was the first BC referendum that was 58% in support of change. The second was the 2016 Prince Edward Island plebiscite that was 55% in support of change. And there have been 2 Vancouver City referenda on changing the civic voting system that also delivered majority support. And in none of those cases did government consider that that was enough of an expression of a desire to change.
Oh,
so
really?
This, in my view, just completely supports Gisela's perspective or assertion that governments tend to use referenda to be seen to be doing something, but they're really unwilling to move forward even when a majority vote in favor of it.
So what are the arguments that the no people put forward? Why? What do they say that is so convincing that it would be a bad idea?
Do we want to give airtime to that?
I don't try to set things up as debates.
Sure.
I don't think debates are much fun, but they must say something.
They do, yes. And you will, if you look at the tactics of the now growing no campaigns, because they're learning as they go along. Each campaign is more effective than the one before, it seems. They've taken a page from the manual of the tobacco lobbyists, and they use fear and doubt. Their job is not to convince anyone that the current system is great or even that it's better. All they have to do is sow enough doubt to make people feel that this isn't quite the right proposal or it's not the right time and we should wait until something better comes along. I don't think they even try anymore to make the argument that our current system is any good. They've given up on that because it's an unwinnable argument. But making the proposal, the new change, look bad is what they specialize in. So in British Columbia, for example, during the 2018 referendum campaign on electoral reform, we saw TV ads showing rioting in the streets. We saw TV ads showing Nazis marching, as if these things were going to happen under a proportional system. So we're going to elect extremists. We're going to see policies that only a very narrow group of people support, even though that's actually impossible under proportional representation. That's the exact opposite. And we're going to lose local representation. And this one particularly burns me because all of the proposals that were on the ballot for BC in 2018 maintained local representation. And yet, exit polls showed very clearly that one of the main reasons people voted against reform was because they had absorbed the false, as it turns out, messaging of the opponents that they would lose local representation. In my riding, every week, we saw ads that showed a picture of an ad saying that your local MP, your local MLA would disappear. And there was a very effective ad, an older woman phoning her local MPs, or I keep saying MP, but in this case it was an MLA, the provincial representative, asking to speak to her local MLA, and she got a recording and blah, blah, blah. The end result was her MLA, the closest one was now in Vancouver, which, is ridiculous for most of the interior. That was never going to happen under any one of the systems. But those fear and doubt messages are extremely effective. And the entire burden then is on the yes side to create, not only to explain the system, because usually governments do a better job of confusing people about the options rather than clarifying them, but also to explain why these myths that are being put out by the opponents are not valid. So it's a very unequal playing field for the two sides in a referendum campaign, which is why Fair Vote Canada, for example, no longer supports referendums as a way of making these sorts of changes. We just accepted that they're too easily manipulated for citizens to vote against their own interests.
Okay. I am a dual U.S. Canadian citizen. And so I often find myself making comparisons. I think that although both of them share this first past the post system, if anything, the problem in the U.S. that is even worse has to do with or even worse in the sense of making elections less representative of the public opinion. It is the gerrymandering and the electoral college and all of the things about the district, the way districting is drawn, and who has control of how they do that. Now, I never hear that kind of complaint about Canada, and I don't know whether it's because it's not a problem here or people just have other things on their minds. Is it relevant here too? And does this have any necessary connection to the PR system that we are proposing, or these are totally different issues?
I'd be happy to answer that briefly. So it once was a problem in Canada, and in, I believe, the mid-1960s, we established independent electoral boundaries commissions and made them, so prior to that, boundaries were in fact formed by the government. And so I think there probably were instances of gerrymandering, but I don't think it was anywhere near as sophisticated as we see in the US right now. But there is actually objective evidence in terms of variation riding size. So it used to be the case that urban ridings would have much higher populations than rural ridings. Those are still permitted following some Supreme Court case rulings, but the circumstances in which they're permitted have been more heavily circumscribed in the last few decades. So you can see a very demonstrable change in the inequities across ridings in terms of riding size since the mid-60s. So we don't really have that problem so much, the gerrymandering. What we do have, I mean, the thing that continues to plague us is that because our current voting system only elects one person, and it's the person who gets the most votes in a particular riding, we have we can draw a distinction between what we call swing ridings and safe ridings. So roughly speaking, about a third of the ridings in the country are in play in any given election, and one third are completely safe. The party can completely rely on winning that riding again and again and again. You can think of, actually, surprisingly, Burnaby South in BC, so an urban riding, for the last 40 plus years has been held by the NDP on an average level of vote supported about 40%. So the Liberals, the Conservatives consistently get 25, 28, 30% of the vote, and never in 40 years have they won that seat. So that's a very safe seat, which is kind of interesting. We see these in Alberta all the time, the ones where the Conservative Party gets 70% support. But then there are a bunch of ridings that just turn on a dime, and you see like there's a recount, somebody won by 1 vote or 10 votes or 100 votes. And so the voting population is the same pretty much year to year, election to election. Very slow changes, as Gisela said before, that we've got generally fairly significant stability in ideological alignment. But particular ridings, if they change a little bit, the outcome of the election can change quite dramatically. And so you can see in Canada's electoral history, if a party, I'm sorry, if one party's candidates have won, say, 40% of the vote, then historically they can win anywhere from about 25 to 65% of the seats in an election.
Mhm.
And it's like, so it does seem to be fairly random, and that is one of the big concerns about our current voting system. It means that very often the results don't reflect how voters voted.
Mhm. Okay, good. So you do not want to get there by using referenda. How do you plan to get there then?
I think there are several approaches that I think electoral reform supporters are pursuing right now. Fair Voting BC is working with another democracy advocacy organization in Nova Scotia called Springtide, and we have launched a charter challenge. So we are arguing that voters have a right to fair elections. They have a right to representation. The Supreme Court has argued in previous rulings that our Section 3 right to vote incorporates a right to effective representation. And we are arguing that you can't be effectively represented if your vote doesn't result in any person of your choosing in Parliament. And so we are launching this charter challenge. We have filed a notice of application, and we have assembled several expert affidavits and a whole bunch of analyses. And we're very, very shortly, in the coming small number of weeks, going to be filing that with a court. So that's one approach.
Okay. Now I've heard of this thing called ranked voting, where you say so and so is my first choice. Here's my second choice, etc. So you would get somebody that you could live with, even if it wasn't your first choice. It might be your third choice, but someplace along the line you would have some kind of satisfaction, I gather. How does that fit into your scheme of things?
It's sort of a component of a voting system. It's one of the ways that you could ask voters to participate in an election, so they could rank the candidates that are being offered. What's more important is whether the ranked ballots are being used in elections like our current system, where you have single member ridings, or whether you have multi-member ridings. And so in single member ridings, which is basically the way Australia does it, they call it a preferential ballot there, they still just elect the one person. And so, yes, in some small number of cases, some voters will be able to contribute to electing somebody who was not their first choice, and they feel some measure of ownership in that. But it doesn't substantially change the overall effect. I mean, if we said in first past the post in Canada, about half of the voters are not represented by somebody they voted for, it's maybe 45% under a preferential ballot in single member ridings. If you use it in multi-member ridings, as the Irish do for single transferable vote, then you get upwards of 80, 85, 90+% of voters having voted for the elected representatives. So then it's proportional. So it's an element in a voting system that can be either majoritarian, like our system, or proportional, like the Irish system.
Thank you. Okay, that helps.
Good.
And I think you've alluded to the Citizens Assembly idea. Tell me more.
Well, yeah, the idea of Citizens Assembly starts with the idea that Tony expressed earlier about vested interests being ultimately what prevents us from moving forward with proportional representation. And what we have to do as citizens is we have to get politicians to recognize that they are in a conflict of interest, and that therefore we need to find a solution, a way to give voice to citizens themselves. Now, that's where the idea of a referendum comes up in theory. In practice, as Gisela has pointed out, referendums have been highly problematic, and they've been used to stop change more than to bring change about. So Fair Vote Canada, other organizations have been looking for another way that might be more effective at getting to hear the voice of citizens. And that's the idea of a citizens' assembly. A citizens' assembly is a very particular form of democratic participation. It's called deliberative democracy. It has a long pedigree going back to the Greeks. The idea is that you choose citizens by way of a structured sample. So it's ordinary citizens structured. You have to agree to be a part of the process. And usually you will choose for something like this, if we're talking about proportional representation nationally, you'd probably be looking at about 150 people that you would choose across the country, create a structured sample of people who are interested, and they would then meet on a periodic basis. It could be on weekends, let's say, for 6 months or 9 months or even a year, depending how often they meet. So very in-depth study of the problematic. They have access to experts. They have access to facilitators. They have lots of time to study the issues. And then that group of representative citizens that were chosen in that way, and therefore they have no axe to grind, precisely because they were chosen at random, will make recommendations on where to go from there. So this would at least give us recommendations with a very, very high level of legitimacy, which is what happened in BC in 2005 and why that referendum did so well, because the STV recommendation that came out of that had a very, very high level of legitimacy. You're still going to run into the political problem if politicians refuse to implement those recommendations, but at least the recommendations are there. They're part of the record, and they're part of the legitimate case for bringing electoral reform.
Is there any place where a whole country has adopted that approach for any significant length of time and with any official stamp of approval? You know, it's not like they're turning them into the legislature, but I love the idea, frankly.
Mm.
And I don't know whether it is workable or not. But I tell you what keeps me awake at night is not so much that the democracies are not structured as well as they should be, as the fact that voters are so goddamn stupid. You know, and there's a guy named David Moscow who wrote a book. I interviewed him because I love the title of his book. It's titled Too Dumb for Democracy. And when you look at the voters in so many of the current populist-led regimes, you see, or the recent Trump regime, and you know, I can name names in Europe, and Bolsonaro and Modi and all these folks. It's a current thing, and it only happens because voters actually, if it's a real democracy, they've really chosen those guys, and they make the worst possible decisions.
Right.
And I think that as of right now, democracies are not making any better decisions than China, or, you know, I mean, they're not making good decisions. And that's really the crucial thing. When you think that the policies that are getting implemented or adopted by genuinely democratic societies are fatal, I mean, they're going to kill us. Then what are we going to do about it? And this has something to do with, I think we need to have much more of an opportunity to have expertise brought back into the picture. People need to be consulted who know what they're talking about. Exactly. And the voter needs to have to listen to people who have deliberated on a particular issue seriously.
Right. And that's exactly where the Citizens Assembly shines. And in answer to your first question, yes, this process has been gaining steam around the world. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, last year released a report called Catching the Deliberative Wave. I think you'd love reading it, Metta. It's a synopsis of how the parallel process, and this doesn't replace government. I want to make sure that we're clear on that. Citizens' assemblies are a way for governments to hive off a complex or difficult topic and get a nuanced answer back from citizens, a very thoughtful and representative response on that particular issue. And then it gives them the opportunity to say, this is what you people wanted after learning from all the experts, and now we're going to implement it for you because this is what the people want. So it's a parallel process. It doesn't replace government, but what it does is it gives them the opportunity to make a non-politically influenced decision on a very complex topic. So, for example, one of the main ones that, the BC model in 2005 was extremely successful and has been used around the world as an example since that time. Sadly, it's sort of forgotten in Canada to a large degree, but other countries picked up on that example. And Ireland, for example, used citizens' assemblies to make recommendations on topics as difficult as abortion in that country, had excellent results, managed to implement legislation that was accepted by the...
And so where was this?
Ireland. So you can imagine how controversial the topic of abortion would have been there. So it's a way to make thoughtful decisions that are well supported publicly on very difficult topics. And that's why what you just said about citizens being too dumb, I don't believe citizens are dumb. I believe we're busy. I think we're asking too much of people to be experts on every topic. So because we can't trust politicians to overlook their own self-interest, we need to have a mechanism to put it back into the hands of people when it comes to looking after our own interests. And that's what this does. It picks, as Royale explained, it's like a jury system, sortition. They're pulling them out of a hat, but they're making sure that they're demographically representative. So, a representative number of each gender, a representative number from each geographical area. And in things like where the topic is electoral reform, I'm sure that they would ensure that, people from a certain party are represented in accordance with their prevalence in the population. So they create what's called a mini public. It's a mini version of the entire country. And they give those people access to all the experts they want. They can call them back if they have any further questions. They can direct their own education process. And it's important to note that this whole project is done at arm's length from government. It's handed over to a neutral third party. In Canada, the company that does that is Mass LBP. They've run these already and are continuing to run them. One of the more commonly referenced ones is the Citizens Assembly Citizens Panel, I believe, on pharmacare, which made recommendations, which sadly were not implemented by the government because not everyone even knew about it. It's harder for the government to ignore these recommendations if they are very transparent about the purpose of the assembly and they make a commitment in advance to implement the recommendations of the Citizens Assembly.
Now there's the rub.
Exactly.
If they're going to make that commitment, I don't imagine very many governments are going to do that. Right?
That's exactly the challenge that we have with governments. They are always going to want to work in their, they can't get around the element of self-interest. But when we have a recommendation from citizens, how can there be any justification for a government to simply say, no, we don't want to do that? It makes it more difficult for them. But yes, you're absolutely right. The rub is in getting them to agree to implement them, but it's still a better path than simply asking them to make changes that they don't want to make.
Yeah. And there's synergy with the Charter Challenge, because what we would be hoping for as a result of that would be that the court would say, yes, we agree that the current voting system violates the rights of voters to effective representation. Government, you are obligated to replace that. What is the process that you should use to choose the replacement? You should hand it over to a citizens' assembly.
Well, is there any precedent for a court to make such a recommendation? That would be a very bold outcome, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So in fact, there are precedents. The Italian courts ruled that certain elements of the voting system there violated citizen rights to, I don't know the Italian legal system, but essentially to equality and to certain representational rights. The Canadian courts have recognized all sorts of rights in relation to elections. So there was a very interesting case in what year was it? I believe 2004, 2006 in New Brunswick, where there was an electoral boundaries redistricting process, and with the goal of trying to equalize the populations between ridings, the Boundaries Commission shifted a Francophone town from a predominantly Francophone electoral district into a predominantly Anglophone electoral district. And the citizens of that town went to court to argue that they could not be effectively represented by the Anglophone MP who would not understand their issues appropriately. And so there's some very powerful language in that precedent about the importance of representation and the priority that the court, that the government should give to ensuring that people had a representative that they wish to see elected. Now, there's language that actually says in the Canadian context that those Francophone voters had a reasonable apprehension of not being appropriately represented by an Anglophone MP, and that was the justification for the court overruling the proposed electoral boundary shift and requiring that the Francophone community nonetheless be included in the predominantly Francophone riding.
I think it's important to point out that we're looking for new solutions to try to get past our first past the post system. This is not, you know, when other countries adopted proportional representation, it's been very rarely due to constitutional challenges. And as far as I know, it's never been due to a citizens' assembly. What's happened in the past is that the political forces aligned themselves in different ways so that the interests of politicians were better aligned with the interests of citizens. And democratic values were taking on at the time. This was at the time of the enfranchisement movement in the early 20th century. So there was this notion about what a good democracy was that was informing the process. And I think it's important that we move back in that direction. That's why this getting politicians to recuse themselves from the process, I think, is a democratic value that we need to instill. And we mustn't forget also that trying to elect more MPs that are pro-proportional representation would be an important thing to do. I think our chances of getting proportional representation are going to be much higher under a minority government situation than under a conservative or a liberal majority system.
You mean right now? I mean, in Ottawa?
Well, yes, we had some hopes over the current situation in Ottawa, but the fact is the minority was still too strong to be able to bring in proportional representation.
Other examples, you know, in terms of the Citizens' Assembly, also not mandated by the courts, that are happening around the world, are taking on some huge topics. In France, there's a National Citizens' Assembly on climate. In the UK, the same thing is happening. This is a recognition that our current political systems are not able to address these long-term challenges which last beyond the next election. So this wave of momentum that the citizens' assemblies are experiencing around the world isn't going away. We're hearing more and more calls for parallel citizen participative processes. So time.
Yeah, and just a final comment about institutionalization of citizens' assemblies. Oregon has the Citizens Initiative Review on an ongoing basis, and they review selected referendum initiatives there regularly, and so it's been institutionalized.
As it has in Belgium, there's a permanent parallel citizens' assembly in the Belgian government now.
Boom. Well, you've got me hooked. I'm not. I was already in your certainly on your side when it came to PR, but I haven't really thought much about the notion of promoting citizens' assembly. That sounds like they don't have to go together as two different projects, but as a package, they make a very good package, don't they?
They do.
Yeah, and I'm now on your team. Count me in. Okay.
Thanks so much, Metta. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.